Welcome back to One Piece Explained. After about 2 months and 4 chapters worth of waiting, Vegapunk's Truth of this World is finally here, and in this breakdown, I'll be talking about how this reveal has been foreshadowed across the series, who else may know about the truth, and what we should expect to see in terms of more reveals in the coming chapters. Really quick though, make sure to like and subscribe. It helps us support me and grow the channel, and you'll also be able to get my weekly manga breakdowns as soon as they come out. Now with that said, let's get into chapter 11-13, Stalemate. This chapter picks back up right where we left off, with Mars approaching the transmission transponder snail that we first saw in Film Red. Now, I talked about this type of snail in depth in my breakdown last week, but one new detail from this chapter is that the right side of the snail's shell seems to have what looks to be a component resembling either a speaker or a rotary dial. The left side featured a keypad, which was shown in the last chapter as well as in Film Red. However, in that movie, this right side component is not present. This is likely because the transmission transponder snails that made their way to Uta were prototypes, and as we know, Vegapunk only finished developing them recently. The bubbling sound that caught Mars' attention at the end of the last chapter is revealed to be Vegapunk's enormous head, like many of us had suspected. He definitely wasn't exaggerating when he said he was going to match the height of a giant, as the head towers over Marcus Mars, who is a fairly tall individual himself. Compare its size to how it was just 2 years ago, when it was only a couple times taller than characters like Kizaru or Kuma. This accelerated growth does make a lot of sense though, given how his brain has been accumulating knowledge from across the 6 satellites as well. Much like us, Mars wonders if Vegapunk is even truly dead, considering his mind is still intact, which harkens back to some questions that we've discussed on this channel across this arc. We know that some notion of the soul truly does exist in the world from the abilities of characters such as Brook and Big Mom, but we also learn that there is some scientific basis for it, given the findings of a West Blue scholar, whom I believe could be Dr. Hogback, but that's neither here or there. As we saw with some of the zombies on Thriller Bark, there is some precedence for some sense of self or consciousness even after a physiological death. When Mars goes to destroy the transmission transponder snail, he realizes that it was actually a decoy, revealing a regular transponder snail underneath it, who was simply relaying the message that it was receiving. This infuriates him as he bursts out of Punk Records in his Itsumade form and reports Vegapunk's intent to carry out Clover's intentions from Ohara all of those years ago. In order to ensure that he could not simply be silenced by death, Vegapunk recorded this message for it to be broadcast across the world, and it'll be interesting to see if the rest of his revelation will include the true name of the ancient kingdom that Clover left out. Meanwhile, we go around the world once again, checking in on various islands as they await Vegapunk's message. Starting off with the East Blue, we revisit Syrup Village and see Mary for the first time since the Decks of the World cover story during the Fishman Island arc, as well as Kaya and the former Usopp pirates whom we last saw during the Decks of the World cover story after Dressrosa. Mary explains that despite being the most affluent household in the village, they don't have a visual transponder snail due to its large size, reinforcing that there is some tangible physical cost to maintaining this technology. Recall that just a few chapters ago, we saw Windmill Village lacked one as well, and both parts of the East Blue look to be observing daytime. Kaya praises Vegapunk's medical expertise, which also makes sense seeing as how she has also been studying to become a doctor for the past 2 years. And also of note, the transponder snail we see here features a design resembling the Going Merry. We see another fun transponder snail modeled after Crocus, who was stoically listening in alongside Laboon at the Twin Cape, also observing daytime. Recall that it was nighttime in Water 7, which is located further down the Paradise half of the Grand Line. We then also briefly check in on what looks to be the communications department of Marine HQ that we've seen a few times before throughout the series. One of the Marines seems to be preparing to record Vegapunk's message. Then we move on to Vegapunk's hometown of Karakuri Island, where Frankie was sent to by Kuma. It looks to be nighttime here, suggesting that it's closer to the second half of Paradise, since both Water 7 and Mary Joie are currently experiencing nighttime as well. We see the residents of Baltimore, including Kiton and his grandfather, who helped out Frankie during his time there. We last saw them in the Decks of the World cover story after Dressrosa, and alongside them here, you may recognize the cyborg lion, snake, and gorilla that we saw in that cover story that Frankie further modified during his stay. A younger child asks Kiton's grandfather about Vegapunk and the Nightmare of Baltimore, which of course was when Frankie accidentally self-destructed Vegapunk's lab. Kiton's grandfather explains that it was Frankie who was responsible for that, and we are once again reminded that the Thousand Sunny is depicted on Frankie's bounty poster. Otis definitely heading somewhere with this gag in the future. Over in the South Blue, we check in on the Birdie Kingdom, where Chopper was sent to during the time skip. Notice that it is night here as well, whereas it was daytime in the other parts of the South Blue that we saw just a few chapters ago. We see Shanba and the rest of the island's inhabitants listening to Vegapunk's message on a transponder snail, mimicking the hairstyle of the people of the island. Over in the New World, even Fololet is tuned into the message, and the pirates on the island seem to be back to their usual activities after Garp's raid during the previous day, though curiously, we only see the unnamed members of the crew. And you'll also notice the skull formation is still cracked from Garp's galaxy divide. We then check in on the Sabaudi archipelago, reacting to the news of Vegapunk's death. Ace's execution was broadcast here from Marineford before the time skip, but now thanks to the transmission transponder snail, Vegapunk is able to broadcast all around the world. Elsewhere on Sabaudi, Duval is listening in alongside his Rosy Life riders, and note that his transponder snail is patterned after the mask Duval once wore. Also, believe it or not, this is the first time we've seen him since the first chapter of the time skip. Back over at the Germa Kingdom, we check in on Neo-Mads after Caesar and Judge teamed up earlier in this arc during the previous cover story. Caesar, though, is distraught at Vegapunk's death, but more so because the whole point of forming Neo-Mads was to stick it to Vegapunk in the first place. And finally, Morgans is upset at the prospect of Vegapunk's new broadcast technology displacing his newspapers, and we last saw him just a few minutes ago watching the stream alongside Vivi and Wapol. There are a few other unnamed locations throughout the chapter. Some of them are vaguely familiar, but none of them look to be an exact match with any known location, though one of these places looks to be Sword Mountain Island, where the Long Arm Kingdom is located. And there's another brief panel of a western-inspired town with these large cacti in the back that somewhat resembles Full Shout Island, where Koala is from. Back over on Egghead, Sanji approaches the northeastern coast of the island just in time to intercept Nostromo's attack on Bonnie. He blocks the blade and jumps off of it to deliver what looks to be a Diable Jambe version of Collier Coupe, knocking Nostromo's head back. I believe we last saw Sanji use this technique against Judge to block a spear. Sanji mentions how they won't go easy on him just because he's old, which feels like sort of a twist on Nami's line to S-Shark earlier in this arc about how she will go easy on him just because he's a kid. Now Nostromo's head becomes engulfed in flame, and while at first one may think this is the result of Sanji's attack, it appears that this is just how he transforms, as his skeletal horse head emerges and bites down on Sanji. It's a bit unclear if the rest of his body is burning here as well, or if these are just part of the horse's main manifesting. Either way, Oimo and Kashi arrive just in time to grab hold of Nostromo, resulting in Sanji being freed as Atlas catches Vegapunk's body, and it's also unclear to me where Nostromo's blade goes when he assumes the full Bakotsu form, as he doesn't seem to be holding it in this panel, but has it once again in hand in the next one as he reverts back to his upper body. So far, Nostromo is the only one who seems to have this sort of partial transformation available to him, and his fluid usage of it has been very interesting. Seemingly inspired by the presence of the Albaf giants, Bonnie uses her distorted future technique, this time wishing for a giant-like future as she descends upon Nostromo's head in a pose very reminiscent of Luffy when he first debuted his Gum Gum Giant technique against Kaido. Over on the backside of the Labo phase, Saturn begins his assault on Robin, and we saw Nami, Usopp, and Chopper brace for whatever was coming in the last chapter, but now we see Brook and Lilith run over from the Sunny to help out. Robin freezes up as she suddenly recognizes this voice and realizes that the ones responsible for the destruction of her people are literal demons. Recall that Saturn was the only elder who did not speak over the transponder snail to York and the Straw Hats earlier in this arc, as his presence on Egghead was supposed to be a secret. As such, she recognizes this voice here for the first time, and the brief flashback we get is a shot recreating a panel from the Ohara flashback, with the line spoken being the same one that we see in that flashback with a silhouetted Saturn. Usually, Robin is pretty good against her antagonists with spider powers, but here, she's in a complete state of shock. Interestingly, Saturn blames Robin's survival on Akainu's incompetence, which Nami doesn't really understand, since the Straw Hats don't have the omniscient perspective on the Ohara flashback, but she makes the right call here that they have to protect Robin, and with that, we get one of my favorite scenes in the series in a long time, with the quote-unquote weaker half of the crew getting this super cool clash against one of the 5 elders. Chopper defends against one of Saturn's limbs with his guard point. Hopefully the fur is durable enough here to prevent him from getting poisoned by his leg, and I'm also curious what becomes of his future island outfit, since the technique requires him to expand and burst outwards. Nami rushes to grab Robin off of the stretcher, while Zeus fends off against another limb. Usopp's technique is a little hard to place here since the explosion on Saturn is a bit obscured. This could just be a regular explosive star instead of a specific pop green technique, while Brook simply freezes and slices off a limb with his soul solid. And if you've been watching my channel for a while now, you know how excited I have been about the prospect of Brook fighting Saturn, or literal Satan himself, so I really hope this fight gets to continue a bit longer before Zoro and Jinbei arrive. Now, just before we get Vegapunk's big reveal, the elders deliberate over what to do and find themselves in a true stalemate, helpless before the scientists' machinations. Recall that their goal at the start of the day was to secure 3 things: York, Punk Records, and the power plant. As such, if they destroy the machines generating the energy for the island in an attempt to stop the message, they will no longer be able to acquire the Mother Flame, and so their hands are truly tied. Now, in his broadcast, Vegapunk stated that he committed 2 crimes against the world government and confirms that if we are hearing this message, then he has already died. The most explicit crime, of course, is his research of the Void Century, which was the basis for the government's mission to assassinate him in the first place. The second crime could be his undermining of the Elder's authority of the Pacifista and placing Bonnie at the top of the hierarchy. And of course, there are plenty of other things Vegapunk has done that the world government would not look kindly upon, such as keeping the existence of the texts of Ohara a secret or continuing to hide the Iron Giant from them. There could be even something more egregious that he's referring to here that we don't know about just yet as well. Either way, he stresses that he doesn't want the listeners to judge whoever it is that kills him as good or bad, and that he himself is not in the position to make that call either. It's not totally clear who Vegapunk is referring to here. It could be that he foresaw the government covering up his assassination and knew the blame would go to someone innocent, so he wanted to get ahead of that propaganda. There's even some speculation that he's talking about Emu specifically, and that Vegapunk is not knowledgeable enough about him to understand his true intentions. Could be. It could also just simply be a rhetorical device where Vegapunk does not want to force a value judgment upon the listener and tell them what to think, instead realizing that simply presenting the information to them will be more effective at leading them toward an obvious conclusion for themselves. Regardless, Vegapunk prefaces the reveal by acknowledging the sheer absurdity of what it is that he's about to say and highlights his obligation to the world to relay this information. Their world is sinking. Real quick, I just want to draw attention to the portrayal of sunlight in these final panels. The last time we saw Oda draw sun like this was at the end of Kuma's flashback in the solemn moment where everyone is paying their respects to Kuma upon his quote-unquote death, of course evoking a very specific type of holy imagery. And I love how our only reaction to this information is not from the 5 elders or the Straw Hats or any of the named characters that we saw across these chapters, but rather some nameless Marine soldiers who are only here out of their commitment to their jobs. Light strikes for them from above as this revelation literally dawns upon them. The light travels from the sky to these soldiers and then beneath the ocean where we are shown aquatic life, among them some mermaids, and this really creates the suggestion that this information is most pressing to the world at large and not just the important characters whose journeys we follow week to week. Now, there's a ton of fun speculation to be had about this reveal with regard to the rising sea levels and the various historical components that we've seen across the series, and I'm sure that's what most people will want to talk about as well, so I will be touching on that in this section of the video, but I do want to preface all of this with the idea that on some level, I'm not necessarily convinced that we will be getting much more in terms of historical reveals from the rest of this message, and if you're interested in the reasoning behind that, be sure to stick around for the next section. With that said, let's get into some fun. The notion that the world is sinking should immediately remind us about the development earlier in this arc when the destruction of Leloucha caused earthquakes across the world and raised the global sea level by approximately 1 meter. I discussed this in depth back in my chapter 1089 breakdown and considered the various examples of places being affected by the rising sea level from across the series, as well as speculated that the reason why the Celestial Dragons displaced the Lunarians and settled atop the Red Line all those centuries ago was to distance themselves from the global consequences that resulted from the use of their weapon against their enemies. In essence, there may be a gradual manufactured raising of the sea level going on by the world government, perhaps in order to increase their control over the world's populations and resources. And while that is still somewhat plausible, I should note, we've seen countless instances of the sea level rising, or examples of it having once been lower across the series, many of which seem to be unrelated to the use of the weapon that destroyed Leloucha, since the Elders were only able to make use of that power recently with the advent of Vegapunk's Mother Flame. Perhaps one of our earliest examples is that of the Sandora River in Alabasta. This river runs through the center of the kingdom and once serviced the entire island, but in recent years has become overtaken by the sea, causing salt water to displace much of the fresh water that once flowed, a consequence of rising sea levels. A little later on, we encountered Long Ring Longland, a ring-like island with 10 connected high points that have been separated due to the rising tide. In the data book One Piece Yellow Grand Elements, it was said that the tide receding to reveal the land connecting these high points contributes to the annual high tide in Water 7 known as Aqua Laguna. Because of this, the sea level seems to rise every year in the City of Water, causing its people to build atop existing buildings to survive. In actuality, it's not necessarily that the sea level has risen, as much as it is that the foundation of the island is actually sinking, which lines up with Vegapunk's announcement here. Either way, Iceberg has been planning to address this problem and save the island, so he will likely be crucial no matter what. Aside from this, we do have some examples of places or structures that curiously exist underwater. Impel Down, for example, reaches the very bottom of the ocean. And there's also a curious bridge project in the East Blue that has been going on for 700 years known as Tequila Wolf. Somewhere in the New World, there are sunken ruins of an ancient civilization, one of which included a symbol similar to the paw pattern found on Kuma's clothing. And more recently, we learned that old Wano exists underneath modern Wano, although this is the result of rainwater flooding the artificial valley more than it was the product of sea level. However, it is interesting to me that when you line up these diagrams side by side, you may at first notice how the sea level has seemed to have risen, but if you look closely, the foundation of the island has actually sunk. Of course, these diagrams may not be uniform nor to scale, but an interesting observation nonetheless. Now, to a non-omniscient observer with a limited point of view, whether something is sinking or the water is rising may be a matter of perspective, even if there is an objective answer. But for a scientist like Vegapunk, one would imagine that they use a language in a more precise manner. So when he says the world is going to sink, I more so expect for that to be the case than that the water level is rising. And I think it's also important to recognize that Vegapunk has come to this conclusion without the knowledge of the global sea level rising due to the destruction of Lelouch. Of course, Vegapunk was not privy to York's actions, such as her providing the Mother Flame to the Five Elders, but it's also unlikely that he was aware that the weapon was even used in the present day, and definitely unlikely at the time this video was recorded. Since both Pythagoras and Shaka are present in the video, this means the earliest that this could have been made was yesterday before they seemingly died. The events of 1089 are taking place in the present day, and we learned that the earthquakes causing the increase in sea level are in real time, 6 days after Lelouch was destroyed. We even see the marine ships reacting to this news while surrounding Egghead. As such, Vegapunk could not have used this event as a data point for his research. He may not be the only person to have come to this conclusion as well. As we know, the Roger Pirates knew the truth about the world's history. Perhaps there is some greater significance to Crocus having turned the insides of Laboon into a habitable vessel, or Rayleigh becoming a ship-coding mechanic in the face of a world underwater. I'll go deeper into Rayleigh's role specifically in just a bit. Could Momonosuke also have decided not to open Wano's borders after learning this truth from Oden's journal as well, considering that taking down the walls would introduce a ton of new water into the surrounding ocean? Then, of course, there's the entire aspect of Joy Boy and his promise to Fishman Island. Noah's purpose is still unclear, but with the impending threat of a flooded world, the connection here feels a little too obvious with the idea of saving humanity using the Ark. We are on the precipice of a huge, game-changing revelation, and I cannot wait to get into the next chapter. But with all of that said, I also have to entertain the idea of whether this revelation is even relevant to the world government. This whole time, we readers, as well as the Five Elders themselves, have been expecting Vegapunk, much like Clover had done in the past, to divulge the secrets of the Void Century, the Ancient Kingdom, or whatever forbidden knowledge the world government has been keeping secret. But at face value, what we got here is more of an environmental concern than it is some arcane revelation. When Vegapunk declared his intention with this message back at the end of 1108, he called it the truth of this world, which we took to mean in terms of the world's history, but you can clearly glean the other interpretation from this as well with regard to the world's future. That's not to say the world of yesterday cannot inform the world of tomorrow, but it would be quite the exciting twist if Vegapunk's primary concern here, as a scholar and as a scientist, was not revealing ancient history that is irrelevant to the average person, but instead to forewarn them about their world's impending demise. After all, people do not have much agency over what has already been done, but they do have much more control over what can be done going forward. Vegapunk's preface of telling the audience not to immediately cast judgment reminded me a lot of Rayleigh's approach when discussing the true history with the Straw Hats back on Sabaody. There, he told the crew how there is nothing they could do even if they were told everything, and how they may come to a different conclusion from the one the Rogers Pirates came to. Both Luffy and Robin declined to learn about the secrets of the One Piece and the Void Century respectively, and instead decided to continue their journey. And that point is quite significant in my opinion. If Vegapunk reveals too much of the true history with this announcement before not only Robin, but the entire world, it undermines Robin's purpose and journey quite a bit. Sure, Robin started piecing together information across the post-time skip arcs, but if all of that was just going to lead to some lore dump from another old guy anyways, then what was the point? From a macro storytelling perspective, I would not necessarily expect Vegapunk to continue to divulge too much about the Void Century or the Ancient Kingdom. Instead, I can imagine he provides more context or evidence from a scientific point of view, which would then leave the details of the true history up to Robin to find out for herself, whether that be on Elbaf or elsewhere. I can also perhaps foresee us getting a brief flashback that we as readers would see, but the characters in-universe would not be privy to. I know this may be disappointing to some readers who are really expecting a hefty lore drop, but I somewhat prefer the big secrets of the world's history to be left for when we're much closer to the end anyways. And who knows, maybe we are actually that close to the end, and Oda feels it's just fine to let Robin get a lore dump here herself. We'll just have to see. That's about it for the big things I wanted to talk about in this breakdown. There are a ton of really cool implications to be had from this reveal, and I'm sure there's even more down the line, so I'd love to read all of your thoughts and speculations in the comments, especially this week more than ever. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like and subscribe, and thank you so much for watching. Stay safe, and I hope to see you in the next one.